With us today is Susan Schoelwer, curator here at Mount Vernon, and she'll be talking to us about the style of Martha Washington. So, Susan, a lot of people have the misconception of Martha Washington that she's this dowdy, frumpy woman. So, could you tell us about how people came to those misconceptions?
Well, I think that we tend to think of Martha Washington as an elderly woman, kind of dumpy, someone's grandma. And I think in part that stems from the fact that most of the portraits that we have of her are painted during the presidency. So it's a period when she's already in her 60s, the last decade of her life. And she is not only a grandmother, she's a great grandmother, and she's very comfortable with that role. I think in the 18th century, there was not the desire to stay 20 something forever. Being a matron was a real well respected role, and she was very comfortable with that. We also see her dominant headgear in those portraits is a mop cap, or as it's come to be known subsequently, a mop cap. And so it's this white frilly cap. And I think in part because it continued to be worn by elderly women in the 19th century. We see a lot of elderly women wearing it, and we think of it as sort of something we associate with a grandmother. But in the 18th century, it was extremely fashionable. It was made of very fine cottons or linens, trimmed with lace, very decorative. It was fluffy. It had lace. It was a confection, and so it was very elegant. And you can see that in the many women who choose to be portrayed in those mop caps, and they have beautiful colored silk ribbon tying them. It's a fashion that arises in the mid 18th century and is part of what in the 18th century was called undress. So it was an at home fashion, but then it becomes high fashion in about the 1780s or so, in part due to Marie Antoinette and this sort of idealization of country living and a simple life. But these were not simple items. So I think we have an image of Martha Washington that stems from her last decade of her life, and we project that backwards onto her whole life. But of course, she was young once, and she was slim once, and she was lively once. And so we don't have the only full garment of hers that we have surviving, certainly in the Mount Vernon collection, is a brown silk dress from the 1790s. It's very much the fashion of the 1790s, but it is a simplified fashion compared to what she would have worn earlier in the century, certainly in terms of its construction. It's more tailored. It's almost more mannish in a style. It doesn't have so many ruffles and furbelows that you would have had earlier in the century. So again, we're projecting these fashions from her later life onto her earlier life. Your question was, what can we say about her style in her early years? And many of the things that we have surviving from, say, the 1750s and 1760s, before she married George Washington as her second husband, or from the first decade of their life together, not things I would characterize as neat and plain. Not restrained, very refined. She's clearly buying the best that she can get from London. Lovely silks, brocaded silks with floral designs woven into the silk. Her wedding shoes, which survive from her 1759 marriage to George Washington, are really some of the most amazing mid 18th century women's shoes that I know of. You often see women's shoes from that period that, well, not often, but you see women's shoes from that period that have survived, and they're constructed out of the same brocaded fabrics that or damask fabrics that the dresses are made from. Very colorful. Martha's are made of a very fine purple silk satin. purple was a very expensive dye, the color of royalty, and they were decorated with what were called spangles in the time. So it's what we would call sequins, or silvered glass beads, silver sequins. Those have tarnished now, so you don't really have a sense of what they were like. But when they were new with this silver on the purple, imagine dancing in the candlelight or the firelight with those. These were really elegant, very, I won't say ostentatious, but they were certainly fancy items. And I think in some sense, you are what you wear. Something about women's shoes. I think these are very symptomatic of her taste.
Susan, I know that we've talked before about Martha Washington's shoes, and they're absolutely beautiful. Could you tell us a little bit more about how they relate to her style and how they're really just indicative of Martha Washington as this incredibly stylish young woman?
Well, before I talk about that, I did want to go back to the question of headwear, because we talked about the mop cap that she wore later in life, and I was noticing in some of the early orders from London in the 1750s and the 1760s, they're ordering aigrettes, or egrets as they are sometimes called, and those are essentially feather plumes, or it could even be a jeweled item that looked like a plume. So it would be a very fancy headdress. So again, think of her wearing, and think of portraits where you see women with these feather plumes coming out of something like a tiara. And imagine Martha wearing something like that as her headdress, perhaps with those purple sequined shoes. Very different from the look of the mop cap that she wore later on. And I think if you start thinking of her in those, it gives you a different picture. In the same way that I think it does if you remember that her nickname was Patsy. And she was called Patsy in her younger life, and George Washington apparently continued to call her Patsy even later on. And I think if you think of her as Patsy Washington with an aigrette on her head, a purple and gold stomacher on her torso, and her purple dancing shoes, you get a totally different picture of the women. So to turn to the question of lace specifically, and the lace that we know that, or that we believe that Martha owned, we have in the collection several pieces of lace that are said to have been part of her wedding costume when she married George Washington in January of 1759. According to descendants, at that wedding, she wore a gown made of a gold damask fabric, a gold damask patterned silk, a petticoat a white petticoat with threads of silver worn through it, those purple and silver shoes, and of course her gold damask dress was trimmed with these lace ruffles, certainly at her sleeves and perhaps at the neckline as well. And the lace that we have that survives with that history is a very fine kind of lace. It's called Mechlin lace, or Point de Malines, after the places where it was made, and it was considered really the queen of laces in the 18th century. So again, we have this sense of her buying the highest quality, the finest kind of lace that she could buy, and putting together a very elegant outfit for a very important occasion in her life. I think the fact that this lace was saved by her descendants and passed down through different branches of the family also tells us, speaks to both its symbolic importance and its real value, that it continued to be prized by generation after generation of her descendants as something very special, both for its association with her as well as just a very fine object of artifice, of craft, of skill, of fashion, of trade. It has so many levels of meaning behind it, and I think
Martha Washington was an incredibly stylish woman, even though people might not think that. And could you give us some documented examples of why she actually was very fashion forward?
So another way of thinking about what the younger Martha's style might have been like, there's a wonderful piece of evidence in the form of a gown that survives with a history of belonging to her younger sister, Elizabeth Dandridge. And this is in the collection at Colonial Williamsburg. It is made from beautiful mid 1700s, about 1750s English silk made at Spitalfields, brocaded with flowers in a very naturalistic design. Absolutely beautiful fabric. And this fabric was evidently treasured and remade, as much fabric was at the time, into a gown about in the early 1770s for her sister when she was married. And it is an open robe gown, which means that it has ruffles down the front. It has a stomacher on view in the front, and then the skirt separates to reveal a petticoat, which in this case was made from the same fabric. In other cases might have been worn from a contrasting fabric, like Martha's wonderful white with silver threaded petticoat. So petticoat wasn't a slip like we think of it now, but part of your costume. And so that very beautiful dress again gives us a sense of the younger Martha. We can also look at her jewelry, which survives both from the 1750s and 1760s, and again another group of jewelry from maybe the 80s and 90s. The first group of jewelry is set largely with garnets, red stones coming out of Bohemia. And those were the most fashionable gems in the 1750s and the 1760s, this deep ruby red color. Martha also had a ring set with diamonds, which was very unusual for that period. But then in the 1780s and 1790s, as the neoclassical style starts to come in and pearls become more fashionable, she switches to seed pearl jewelry, which is more delicate, I think, than the garnet jewelry, and certainly it's white, and it contrasts then with the rich dark brown of the dress we have surviving from the 1790s. But I think we see her in that transition. Even though she's getting older, she's keeping up with the times, and she's perhaps switching to something that, because of its whiteness and its connection with the neoclassical aesthetic, speaks to what her husband called his Republican style of living. So a studied simplicity, not plainness, but a very highly refined, beautifully crafted simplicity that intended to hearken back to the ideal of the ancient civilizations of Rome and Greece, the ideal of white marble, and that speaking very much to what the ideals of the Republican government and democracy and liberty. And so it was a very conscious choice. But in connection with our discussion of lace, I was also noticing how delicate that seed pearl jewelry is. And there is one necklace of hers that is in our collection here at Mount Vernon that the seed pearls are kind of strung in a way that really suggests a collar with scallops, and it's strung from two white silk ribbons, but it's very much, I think, using the pearls to give an effect like the lace that she might have worn earlier or might well still have been wearing in a different way. So a very nice connection there.
People often think of wearing lace on your wedding day, and this is a great opportunity for you to talk about Martha Washington's wedding lace.
I really like the idea of referring to lace as the power dressing of the 18th century. I think, again, communicates some of what its meaning was at the time, that if you could afford to buy lace and you had the discernment to buy lace and recognize fine lace, it's just like recognizing a designer look now.
The Washingtons knew that all eyes were on them during the war, during the presidency, and even afterwards. And how did that affect their style?
There are quite a number of documents. I think if we look back through the Washington papers, and particularly the financial records, where we can begin to really dig up a lot more material about Martha Washington as a consumer and her style and her fashions. information that hasn't really been systematically tapped, I think, by her biographers who haven't been perhaps so interested in that, and who perhaps take that quote about plain and neat from Washington's writings and make assumptions without looking at the objects. In fact, the documents suggest to us that she was that she loved fine things, that she had many wonderful examples of costume, jewelry. I think there's probably more jewelry surviving from Martha Washington than any other 18th century American woman. And she was clearly a discerning consumer. There is one letter that she writes back to a tradeswoman in London, a Mrs. Thorpe, who was probably a milliner. And apparently the Washingtons had ordered the previous year for Martha's daughter, Patsy Custis, a suite or suit of lace items. And it's a little unclear. It's a little difficult to sort of parse exactly what's happening. But very clearly, Martha Washington was not happy with what she had gotten. And she makes clear to Mrs. Thorpe that the pieces of lace that she got, I think there were ruffles, and I'm not sure there were 3 or 4 pieces that she got. There were not as many pieces as she expected to get, and they were not as fine a quality as she expected, and the cost was much higher than she expected it to be. And she mentions that she had shown these pieces that she had received to several other ladies who, I forget exactly how she words it, but it's sort of, she'd clearly shown them to other ladies who have knowledge of such lace and what it should be like and how much you should expect to pay for it, and that this was not as was expected. And she also makes the point that she thinks that some of the pieces that she got were such that she could have gotten in any ordinary shop in Williamsburg, say, and she shouldn't have had to order to London for these things. But she apparently goes ahead and sends another order to Mrs. Thorpe for the next year and basically says, well, you better do better. So again, I think we have a sense from the documents that she's buying regularly, and she has enough knowledge and discernment to know exactly what she's looking for. I think this also brings into play her own experience and training as a needleworker. And it's clear from items we have surviving in the collection. We don't know where she trained, but she clearly had extensive training in needlework. She clearly liked doing it, and she apparently had an artistic bent. We have chair cushions that she made in worsted cross-stitch, a kind of canvas work.
You've talked to us about how the perceptions of Martha Washington are largely shaped in part by the paintings that were depicted of her in her 60s. Now, do we have any documentation or any evidence of what her clothing might have been like when she was younger?
I think that research hasn't really been done. I think combing through the financial records, the letters,
giving you an idea,
to see really what's there in the documents that I looked at just relatively quickly to refresh my memory. Mm-hmm. You have some terminology problems. That lace is also used to refer to the ties that lace up bodices or mm-hmm. that lace up different articles of clothing. And you have what we would call lace, sometimes being referred to as lace, sometimes being referred to as point, P-O-I-N-T,
yes.
Because it is a term for a kind of lace, needlepoint lace, needle lace. And so in many cases, people who are doing the transcribing and editing mm-hmm. of some of the documents are perhaps more interested in political history or military history than they have been in costume history or consumer history, and some of those fine points get lost. Obviously, to do a computer search for point is going to turn you up a lot of references, so it could be a time-consuming search. But if you look in biographies of Martha Washington, you get a couple of pages devoted to her dress, and a lot of times that is based on recollections, people describing her or descendants talking about it later, not looking systematically at what the surviving fabrics are or what the primary documents actually say. So I think that costume historians, curiously enough, have not really looked at Martha Washington because she's such an icon that it hasn't really been unpacked. But Martha Washington biographers have not been particularly interested in what I will call the stuff. So I think there is a rich and inviting opportunity for research there. We know, for example, in addition to the pieces of lace in our collection here at Mount Vernon, we have quite a number, maybe 2 or 3 dozen pieces of fabric that are said to have been cut up from her various dresses, sometimes made into needle cases or other sort of sewing accoutrements, sometimes just preserved as fragments of Martha Washington's dresses. There are a lot of these in collections all over the country, and some of them match up. And sometimes you can get needle marks to begin to get a sense of what the construction of the costume was. So between the primary document research and the surviving materials, I think there's a lot of opportunity there.
So did Martha really understand what it took to construct lace or other kind of needlework in order to make informed decisions about her lace purchasing?
Embroidery that is attributed to her. We have whitework embroidery that is attributed to her. We have at least 3 quilts that are believed to have been made by her. They all display really high quality, even exquisite needlework, usually in a more complicated vein than it would have to be to achieve much the same effect. So I think, in addition to having knowledge as a consumer, she also had experience as a practitioner.
With the formation of the United States of America, it was the start of a totally new government, governed by the people, a republic. And because of that, George and Martha Washington adapted their style. And could you tell us about that?
So as part of the creation of the new republic, and George and Martha Washington are both very conscious of the precedent that they are setting. First, for Martha Washington as the general's lady, we know that she spends slightly more than half of the actual time period during the Revolutionary War actually at George Washington's headquarters, and not at Mount Vernon. So she's very visible to the men of the Army, the officers of the Army, their wives who are also in camp, foreign soldiers who are coming to assist with the revolution, representatives of Congress. She's very visible. And part of the whole lead up of protest prior to the actual outbreak of military hostilities is, of course, the whole kind of non-importation movement in America. And lace being a fine and very expensive imported item is singled out with other textiles as something that's going to not be imported. Something as one of those luxuries that we can either do without or we can make at home. There's often, I think, a great deal of misunderstanding of the kind of textiles that Americans could make domestically in the 18th century, because it's pretty coarse utilitarian wear. There are no American textile mills who are capable of producing anything like what can be coming out of England. So not importing textiles as well as the trimmings, the laces, the ribbons, the braids, all of that kind of thing is a real change in consumption patterns. But I think to begin with, for Martha as the general's lady to appear in camp, she's not going to want to appear in the finest society fashions. For example, when they're at Valley Forge, and it's a very hard winter for the soldiers. And they know that in Philadelphia the parties are going on and people are continuing to enjoy life. For Washington, and I think by connection for Martha, there's a sense that this is a different ball game here. This is a Republican army. This is a general who is the leader of a Republican army of men who are there because they are fighting for a joint cause. And there's a real sense of sharing in their hardships. And there's a very clear demonstration of this in Martha's part, in that for women of her social class and economic status, doing decorative needlework, back to the needlework, doing decorative needlework during socializing would have been very much a part of what you did. When she comes to camp, she makes very clear, we're not going to do fancy silk embroidery. We're going to do knitting. We're going to make stockings for soldiers. We're going to make shirts. So shifting those skills in a different direction that I think is part of the Republican ethos, that we're all in this together. Fast forward then from the Revolution to the period of the presidency. Again, the Washingtons know they are very much in the spotlight with creating a new model of how do you be a head of state who is also just an ordinary citizen, not divinely anointed. You're only going to be the head of state for a certain period of time, but during that period of time, you have to represent your country, your government, your republic, your ideals in a fashion that will be acceptable to foreign diplomats who are coming in and don't really know what a Republican government is. None of that is defined in the Constitution. George Washington articulates very clearly that he's very conscious that everything he does will be a precedent. And it's equally clear that Martha is very conscious of this. She's conscious that who she socializes will be watched. She makes one reference in a letter home that she feels somewhat like she's in a cage, and she has to get up every morning and have her hair dressed, which is something that she is apparently not been accustomed to doing at home when she might. That was one of the reasons for having a mop cap in order to go up back to headwear, that for your day wear when you were at home, you would put on this lovely mop cap and your hair would be kind of covered up. Well, she knows she's going to be observed, and so all of that changes. And the styles of lace, I think, have changed by the 1790s, so that instead of you're seeing lace on the edges of kerchiefs, for example, that are filling in the bodices, the necklines of the dress. So you still have lace being worn and used as edging in costume, but it's you're having a shift perhaps from some of those floral brocaded silks and the richly colored damasks with lace as ruffles or as trimming, to muslins and cottons being used for the ruffles, and they're just being edged with lace instead of being a whole lace ruffle. So there are definitely changes going on, but I think a continuity of lace still being an element of power dressing.